Hello, American Crochet Association. Salena Baca here, founder, host, lead educator with the ACA, and I'm here to give a quick little video tutorial on our tip today for Tip Tuesday. Now, the tip today is, does my chain count as a stitch? Whether or not it does, what should I do when working either in rows or in the round? So I'm going to show you what it means for either one of these scenarios. I'm going to give a quick little demonstration. Now, let's say you're working in rows and your pattern says chain 3 counts as a stitch. So let's demonstrate what that means and what you could do so that you understand where you are going to work and where you're going to stop. Okay, so I'm working double crochet stitches. I'm going to chain 3, 1, 2, 3. Now, this is going to be my starting or turning chain. It's actually both because it starts my row and I'm actually using it to turn my work, right? So this does count as a stitch. That's what my pattern says. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to mark this third chain with a stitch marker. Now you can use any kind of stitch marker that you'd like, bobby pins, these little adjustable round ones, whatever makes sense for you. Go ahead and use those. So I'm marking the third chain, right? 1, 2, 3. Now, the reason I'm marking that is because my pattern says chain 3, that does count as the first stitch. So that means I want to recognize this in its whole, and that's the top of it. Now, because this is my first stitch, it occupies this space. Now, I can tell that this is the very first stitch, and this is the space that it occupies because I can count, loop on my hook. This is the third chain. It's marked with a stitch marker. This is the second. This is the first. It goes here. So when I turn my work, I'm going to ignore that, okay? Because it's already being occupied by this very first stitch, and my next stitch is going to be worked right here. Now, when I go through this entire row, and then I chain up, and then I come back across, where am I going to stop? It's going to be right here. Now, I'm going to stop right here, and I know that I'm going to stop right there because I mark the top of my very first stitch. So that's going to be a great indicator in terms of where to stop. Once I work my stitch right here, I'm going to remove that, and I'm going to start all over again following my pattern. Now, what if you're working in rows and your pattern says chain 3 does not count as a stitch? Well, let's take a peek at what that means. Okay, so I'm starting back from the beginning. Here I am at the end of my row. Pattern says chain 3, 1, 2, 3, does not count as a stitch. What that means is I'm going to completely ignore this chain 3. So I'm going to look at chain 1, 2, 3. I'm going to ignore it. It doesn't count for anything. I'm not using it in terms of my stitch counting and recognition. So I'm going to place a stitch marker on the loop on my hook, okay? Now when I do that, that's going to actually mark my very first stitch that I'm going to make. Now, because this doesn't count, loop on my hook, stitch marker, chain 1, chain 2, chain 3, those don't count. This is my first stitch. That's where I'm going to place my first stitch of this row. So when I turn my work and I work my very first double crochet, this is where it's going to go. So I'm going to work my very first double crochet, and as I work it, I can see that, you see the stitch marker that I placed on the loop of my hook? It's actually identifying the top of the first stitch that I just made. So perfect. That way, I'm going to leave it there. When I go all the way across this row right here, I'm going to do the same thing, use a stitch marker to mark the top of my very first stitch. When I'm working back across, I know to stop right there. Okay, so that's working in rows. Now let's talk about working in rounds. The same concepts apply, but I do have something worked in joined rounds right here. Now, when I started this round, I'm going to, let's assume it either way. Chain 3 counts as a stitch, chain 3 does not count as a stitch. This right here shows a chain 3, chain 1, chain 2, chain 3. We're going to not count those. So we've placed the stitch marker right here, assuming that this does not count as a stitch. And what that means is we've ignored it. We're ignoring chain 1, 2, 3. Okay, there's no marking identifiers. Then we've followed the pattern. We've gone all the way around. Now, before we join, same tip applies to working in rows. You want to count to make sure not only have you followed the pattern appropriately, but then you're going to double check and count all of your stitches to make sure that you have appropriate amount of stitches. Again, if your pattern says chain 3 does not count as a stitch, this doesn't count. So when you're counting, you start from here. 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. Okay, chain 3 doesn't count as a stitch. There's my stitch marker. I have followed the pattern, I've counted, I have the exact amount of stitches. Now I know this is where I'm going to join, okay? Because I'm ignoring that beginning chain 3. So when I slip stitch to join, it's going to be in that space right there. The stitch marker has served its purpose, so I can remove it. However, if you're new to working in rounds and rows, you might want to leave it there, because if your next round says chain 3, does not count as a stitch, you're going to place that stitch marker on the loop on your hook, and you might wonder, where do I place my first stitch? It's going to be right here, okay? All right, now what if it says chain 3 does count as a stitch? Okay, so the stitch marker would not be right here. It would be on the top of the very third chain. So if you chain 1, 2, 3, it does count as a stitch. That's where you're going to join. So whenever you began this round and you chain 3, your stitch marker would go into the top of that. And if you were counting that, excuse where my stitch marker is, where I'm not going to fumble with that right now. Let's pretend it does count as a stitch. That's where I'm going to join. So I would join into the top of this chain 3 right here. And again, your stitch marker would be there. So after you chain for your next round, whether or not it counts, you either are going to place your first stitch there because your chain doesn't count, or you're going to ignore it because it's already occupied by your first chain. Okay? All right, guys, so that is all I have for you guys today in terms of this tip. I hope this was helpful. If this was a helpful little tip for you, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up, give it a heart, and please share this video in at least one place where you enjoy crochet if you feel that this will be a helpful tip. Now, I know that people in our communities ask all the time whether or not your chain counts as a stitch or where to place your first stitch, so hopefully this video can help those individuals. You're welcome to tag people in the comments if you feel it will help them directly. And there's also a nice little blog post that we've had with these exact same tips that you can find in the video description. I hope you guys enjoyed this tip today with the American Crochet Association. I look forward to seeing who you share it with, not only by clicking the share button, but also by tagging your friends in the comments. Peace, love, crochet. Thank you for watching the ACA. Have a great day.